Good evening, everybody. There goes the laptop. Good evening. Welcome to, yes, clap if you must. Welcome to another fine installment of IGDA Toronto. This is our next event after the last one, which I hope you enjoyed. And you're bound to enjoy this one. I want to do a couple of announcements, but first I'd like to thank our sponsors. Our bronze sponsors, Get Set Games, Big Viking, Emmanuel Abduman's Media's Law, Massive Damage, and the Academy of the Impossible. Our silver sponsors are KPMG, George Brown College, and the City of Toronto, who provide space for us. Our gold sponsors are Ubisoft Toronto. Our gold sponsor is Ubisoft Toronto. And another venue sponsor tonight is the Office Pub, where we will be retiring for some drinks later on. So look forward to that. Announcements. Events coming up on our calendar. The Electronic Superjoy team, as part of the Indie Mega Booth charitable thing, they're doing some fundraising for sick kids on November 2nd. I think what you do is you pay to stream them playing their own game and losing, and your money goes to sick kids. Hinterland Games is a distributed team, including some members of some folks from Toronto, and they're just wrapping up a successful Kickstarter campaign for their game, The Long Dark. Give them a hand, yeah, why not? So as of about now, I think you have, what is it, only 12 hours to become a backer and jump on that bandwagon. Bit Bizarre is a marketplace for game-related stuff. They ran one in the summer over at Bento Miso, and they're running another one, the Winter Market, on December 7th. So they're taking applications now if you'd like a table or you'd like to hawk stuff at the Bit Bizarre on December 7th. So go to bentomiso.com, get in on that. The video game show is a comedy improv show about video games at the Comedy Bar, and that's tomorrow night at 8. Tickets available, I believe, at the Comedy Bar or on the site. Game Curious is a weekly book club for video games for those who are new to the hobby. So none of you, but if you have a mom or a friend or a granddad or whoever who wants to get into video games, that's like an ongoing weekly thing. So that's Saturday from 5 to 7 at the Academy of the Impossible. A new group is formed up for Unity users. Who uses Unity in the room? Yeah, a lot. Who's been to the group so far? Who went to their first meeting? Just a couple. All right, so the rest of you will have to go on October 17th at 6:30 p.m. That's at Yukon Games. So Wednesday, October 23rd is game day for Fall Tour Interactive, which is like a student pub crawl, except instead of pubs, they crawl studios, and then they have some speakers in if you can't crawl the studios. So that's for first-year students in game studies. Go to falltourinteractive.com. If you run a business and you would like to be represented, I think you can still talk to Tim and get involved in that. Unplugged 2 is a weekend nerd fest somewhere near Regent Park, October 26th to the 27th, and we have some folks in this room who are going to be there presenting. Check out unpluggedexpo.com. There's so much stuff going on, you guys. We're not even halfway through. No, I'm just kidding. We're almost there. Dames Making Games meets October 28th at Bento Miso. That's dmg.to. Torontaru is a drinky fest. Runs every single month. Wednesday, October 30th is the next one at 8 p.m. I believe it's at Getwell again. Yeah? No? Yeah, good. And GamerCamp 2013 is on November 1st. You can get your tickets at gamercamp.ca. Finally, MIGS, the Montreal International Games Summit, is November 10th to the 12th in Montreal. I hope you got all that. There will be a quiz. If you didn't, the Hand-Eye Society is keeping a really good events calendar. So if you go to handeyeSociety.com, check out their calendar. It's really well maintained. And if you want your own event up there, you can contact them because we have nothing to do with it. But I wish we did because it's awesome. Cool. So I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight. He comes all the way from Montreal, and he's the former executive director of the IGDA. So he was the big boss of the mothership, and he's currently one of the co-founders at Execution Labs, which I'm sure he'll tell us all about when he's up here. Please welcome Jason Della Rocca.
All right, I'm mostly just curious about what the Academy of the Impossible is.
They do the impossible, Jason.
I've never heard of that. That's.
If you want the possible, then you go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's an awesome name. Execution Lab is also, interestingly enough, our initial pitch presentations had an image of a guillotine on them, but they figured that wasn't quite the variation of execution that we really meant. So we went with the cool robot instead. So yeah, most recently, co-founder of this thing called Execution Lab, which is kind of oftentimes hard to explain. We fund indie developers, indie startups doing mobile games We also incubate them, which means providing them a space to work, and we provide development tools and resources and mentorship and all that kind of good stuff. But this presentation is not specifically about Execution Labs. It's much more broadly about funding your project and or funding your studio. And one of the interesting things with Execution Labs is that we've had to sort of fill this gap between the venture or investment community and game developers. Traditionally speaking, game developers are not super good with putting suits on and going to pitch in front of investors and worry about all that side of things. Developers are good at developing, and there really had not been that much sort of bridges between games and certainly the venture side, as well as other aspects of finance and funding. And so, for one thing, Execution Labs itself is venture funded. We are sort of at the mercy of our own investors. We don't have any government money. We don't have, we're not linked to a school or anything like that. So we actually had to go out and knock on doors and raise funds for ourselves to then, what we say, we generally like tricked the venture capitalists to give us money so that then we can turn it around and give it to the indies. But we didn't actually trick them. But, so we're completely venture funded. So going out there in the real world to chase down money, in part, is where we educated ourselves on how to interface and communicate with the money side of things, and that's part of the teaching and learning that we provide to the developers we work with. But I suppose first, the best bit of advice I always like to give before I dive into questions of funding and chasing money, et cetera, is the best time to take someone else's money is never. If you don't actually need the money, sounds counterintuitive, but if you can bootstrap, if you have your personal savings, et cetera, if you don't absolutely have to take external funds, you're always better off. Now the reality is not all of us have a big piggy bank full of $1,000 bills to fund our projects, so we often do have to go out in the real world and chase money. There's a video I'm going to play, and hopefully it works. Just the audio we're having trouble with. So whenever I think of indies and funding, we're going to do this. Oh, yeah, sorry. All right, we'll do this and see if it works. How do we go?
Today I got an Xbox 360.
How's that?
I got it at Costco in one of those bundles where you get an extra controller and a copy of Halo 3.
Yeah, bro, get the new Madden. Hi, my weak friend code is 199.
Who wants to trade Pokemon? I've got a Jigglypuff. Street Fighter 4. I made a game for real. It's called Box Hero. Just made it in my spare time. Just trying to start a company, maybe someday make a lot of money with it.
That's the Mega 64 video that was part of the promotions for the IGF a few years back. Does anyone know who they actually didn't punch? Who was that? Does anyone know? Nobody knows. Shame on you all. It's Dan Paladin from the Behemoth. They did Castle Crashers and Alien Hominid and a bunch of other awesome indie stuff. I think that was either that year or the year before they had won a bunch of the IGF awards. So he was the one guy who didn't get punched. Anyway, so I suppose there's to a certain extent this kind of romanticization of what it means to be indie. Everyone knows who this is. Phil's actually a friend of mine, although and I tend to use him as the example as the romantic indie. But I'm sure he's going to do a Twitter shitstorm on me someday. But anyways, so this idea of kind of this lone creator, starving and going kind of crazy, whatever, creating their oeuvre or whatever. And I mean the reality is that Phil is not fundable. right? No sane investor is going to give Phil money, although he did get, I think he got some early, well, not CMF, it was before the CMF, he did get some early telefilm money. And then this sort of begs the question in terms of, you know, how do you define indie or indiness, or what's even investable? And so I tend to think of it across two axes. That's a bit thick. Hold on. This is not my usual. No, this is the one. Sorry. Where is the? Oh no, it's the pencil. I want the marker. All right, let's get rid of that. All right, let's try that again. There we go. Much better. So across two axes, the vertical is creative. Sorry, this is not what I normally use. Creative independence and legal independence. So I tend to define indiness or independence across these two axes, where when you have both creative independence, meaning you can work on the games you want to work on, you can generate your own ideas and IP, as well as the legal independence, meaning nobody owns you, you don't owe anybody anything, you're not a subsidiary, some bigger entity. That's kind of indie in there. When you have legal independence but not creative independence, that's kind of work for hire, right? So you might be a standalone company, a little outsource shop that it's you and some friends own it, and you do a bunch of art assets or outsource work for other companies. So you don't have creative independence, but you have legal independence. So I don't consider that indie. I consider that sort of outsourcing or work for hire. Internal studios of sort of large companies or publishers would go in here, internal. So they have, they're not legally independent because they're an internal studio, internal team of a much larger company, and they don't necessarily have creative independence. That's not to say they don't do creative work or artful work, or they don't have opportunities to innovate, but you don't generally have internal teams running off making up completely new franchises and brands, or at least not with any degree of kind of true independence. And then the more sort of funny one over here might be kind of a skunk works, where you're an internal team, but you're like a little R&D shop that's sort of in the back closet that nobody knows about, and someone at Ubisoft or EA says, go figure out some stuff on Oculus Rift or something, go play with it. And so you're not legally independent, of course, because you're still within the much larger studio, but you have some degree of creative independence because you're running off and exploring new technologies or new platforms. And so, I mean, really only the very big publishers generally have room for that kind of R&D or skunk works. In terms of what's investable, it's really only this quadrant to a certain degree. Work for hire is not investable because it's not a scalable business, from a venture point of view. Meaning, you're lucky if you're an outsource shop if you get 10% profit on the projects you do, and usually it's less than that because the client always wants you to rework stuff. So it's not an attractive business model. And then of course, the internal side that's lacking legal independence. Well, generally these are already public companies, or much larger, massive companies that are not generally taking in sort of investment dollars in that sense. So the reality is that independent studios or indies are in fact the best target for funding. Good news for all of you. However, there's still sort of a spectrum of indiness as well. Where maybe over here you have kind of true kind of indie starving artist type, maybe personified by a Phil Fish type. Then all the way at this other end of the spectrum, I don't know what the label is even for this, but Valve. Valve technically, by my definition, is an indie or independent because they have both creative and legal independence. But yet, I don't think they're necessarily out there chasing VC money or asking to own VC for a production grant or whatever. And then you have something in between here, which I tend to call an independent studio. And here, a local example of that might be someone like Cappy, right? 20-person shop, I don't know, how much are they? They're about 20 people now, I think. You know, producing several projects. They're a legitimate business. They actually have revenues. You know, they're not swimming in bags of money yet, but you know, they're a going concern, and they're sort of, you know, trying to get projects made and you know, supported, et cetera, et cetera. And so, generally speaking, you know, this is where the venture type funding would come in, because VCs tend to invest in companies more so than projects. But certainly on the project side, there is opportunities for sort of the solo indies. And that sort of brings us to the biggest kind of divide or question you have to ask yourself when you're looking for money is, are you looking for money for a single project, or are you looking for money for your company? And it's an important distinction. Maybe we can close the door, please. Thank you. And Josh, you got in just before we closed the door. All right, so project-based financing versus company. It's an important distinction. Two of the main things is the economics and the control. So the economics of project-based financing generally is based on rev share. Right, that someone's giving you money, whether it's a publisher or even the CMF, they're giving you money based on the idea that you're going to pay them back on future revenue. So it's a rev share type deal. You know, each deal is a little bit different, but it's you know, generally speaking, it's revenue share. Whereas company, it's not rev share, it's equity, or just actual shares in the ownership of your company. That an investor is investing in the company because they think that company is going to grow in value over time, and they want to own shares of that company so that they can, you know, when you get bought by Google for $200 million, they get their 10% or 15% or whatever the case may be. So the economics are quite different, and what you're trading off for the money is also quite different. And then in terms of control, generally speaking, on the project side, it's for control of the IP itself. Not always the case, but often there will be a discussion of who's going to own that IP. And if it's not, for example, a publisher taking outright ownership of the IP, saying, well, we're paying all the money, so we want to, you know, we want to own the IP. You know, at least they will require certain rights on that IP, like first right of refusal on sequels, or you know, merchandising rights, or you know, whatever other kinds of rights around that intellectual property. The control aspects are around that particular project or that particular IP. Whereas on the company side, you know, it's about it's about the board, right? It's about the actual leadership and direction of the company. Where and there's two James, there's two seats right here in the front if you want to. I won't spit that. I didn't bring it from the throat, you thought. So this was the one that oftentimes scares people, right? It's like, I don't want to take, you know, investor money because you know, then I'm going to have to you know, answer to a board, and they're going to fire me as the CEO and all this kind of stuff. Where I mean, if you sign a really crappy deal, okay, that may happen to you. But generally speaking, an investor doesn't want to overthrow you or have this sort of big, you know, coup or whatever. You know, they want to support you and support your efforts. I mean, if they're giving you money, it's because they believe in your vision. They want to see you succeed. They want the company to grow in value. But when you are signing those deals and taking money, you do have to be mindful of the issues around board control, who has how many votes, who has how many seats on the board, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, this actually was an area of contention when we took on our investors, and that all the investors wanted a seat at the board, and we sort of had to ensure there was parity so that we can sort of maintain control of the board. Generally speaking, if things are going well, it's not something you have to worry about. Is if you're doing a crappy job, then you know, maybe there might be issues. But again, generally speaking, the control questions are over the control of the company and sort of strategic direction, as opposed to the individual you know, rights of the And so which direction you go in, this is actually something you need to think about. Because the types of investors, the sources of funding, how deals are structured, et cetera, vary greatly depending which side of sort of this divide you're on, and you know how you approach it and who you go after, et cetera. All right, so I'm going to touch on project-based funding fairly quickly because these are the ones that people should be relatively familiar with. And I saved you the pain of having me to write all those out. But so a big one is the day job, right, or past job, right? How many indies in the room are still working a day job and making games on the side? Okay, so a few of you. Or a past job, right? You know, you got a big bonus check and or you know, pink slip with a you know sort of a package, and so you got some personal runway there. Credit cards, I mean, a lot of devs that end up maximizing their credit cards is not one that I recommend. You know, friends and family. Patronage is not one that you see often, but there are a few examples where it's sort of like the Renaissance style of funding. I know a couple of well-known indies, you know, have these kind of silent patrons that just love their work and say, you know, how much do you need to live? Well, here's, you know, X dollars a month, just so you don't have to worry about, you know, putting food on the table. Like, just keep, you know, creating. Festivals and contest prizes is a big one as well. But you can't really build a business model off of winning, you know, contests because, of course, you know, you have to win. But you know, winning the IGF or something Unreal or some of these other contests, I mean, you know, can be upwards of 50, in some cases $100,000 of prize money. Crowdfunding, of course, is super popular these days. Publishers, you know, depending on what kind of game you're making, a publisher is still sort of a great source of funding, and probably still the biggest source of funding in the game industry today. I mean, we're in Canada, so government programs obviously is another source of project-based financing. Yeah, interestingly enough, there's usually no funding sources to fund companies, right? It's all project-based, which is interesting. Banks are not really an option for project financing for indies. Banks, you know, unless you want to use your house as collateral, banks are not good sources of funding. And I mean, not so much these days, but a few years ago, there's a lot of talk about project bond financing, which is also known as film-style financing, which is you generally fund a slate of games, and there's a bank and a guarantor and an auditor that checks that you're meeting milestones and all this kind of crap. And generally, it's what's sort of being explored more so in Europe to fund console AAA development. And so it's not my, anyways, I mentioned it there because it's come up a few times, but film-style financing, I would not say is really a viable option for indies. And then another one that comes to mind is like alpha funding, right? So a bit like what Minecraft did, right? You get the game to a certain point, you put it out there on the interwebs, and you ask people to give you money to kind of keep working on it and have early access and all that kind of stuff. So alpha, alpha funding would be another option. I need to update my slide. So in most of these cases, it's some combination of taking money in exchange for revenue share, or future revenue, as well as some discussion over control of that IP. So for example, the CMF, I think they have a rule in there that says you can't like sell the ownership of your IP to non-Canadian interests. I don't know who's more familiar with the CMF, right? So you can't sort of just sell your IP to an American investor because the CMF is invested in your product. So there's certain restrictions and stuff like that. But anyways, so all of these here have some combination of giving up rev share and a debate over the rights over the IP. All right, moving on. The more interesting one I find is the venture side. And the venture side tends to apply to companies, as I said before. When you go look at VCs or angel investors, They're looking for a team, they're looking for a company that has a vision, a company they believe that will grow in value, and you know, if that's the case, then you can go knock on their doors. If you just have your little sort of dream project, you know, you want to make, I don't know, your childhood poem game or something, like nobody's going to give you money to do that. That's, you know, you just pay for that out of your pocket or something, or get you know, the CMF to think that it's innovative. But anyway, so if you have a company with a vision and you want to go get money, you have to think about sort of where you fall on the sort of company life cycle. All right, so this is well, dollars, or it's revenue, or yeah, revenue and profit. This is time, zero intercept, and we'll use green. So most companies, from a cash flow point of view or profitability point of view, you know, we essentially start up burning money right as we develop our initial project. You know, then it's released. We hopefully generate some revenue, which then hopefully turns into some profit, and then you kind of grow from there. And so, just to simplify, might look something like, oh gee, I ran off the. You know, it might look something like that, where you know, this here's sort of the break even line. So in the beginning, I'm burning you know, funding, and then I release product, I start generating, and then I break even, and off I go. So if you're lucky, that's how it's going to look for you. Now, who you chase for money depends on what stage you're at here. And so pre-profit, there's kind of three sources, and then over here as well. All right, so in the very beginning, it's what's called the 3 F's, for family, friends, and fools. or what's also called as love money, because only someone who loves you will give you money at that risky of a stage, right? So this is, you know, you're just getting started off. You really don't have much. It's you and a buddy or two. You've got a crazy idea. You have a vision of the kind of company you want to make and the games you want to make, and you know, you need capital to kind of hire another programmer and, you know, buy some machines and kind of, you know, get going. You know, that's when you turn to your mom and say, hey mom, you know, can you lend me a few bucks? Or if you got a rich uncle, or the fool is, you know, you meet someone drunk at a bar and you convince them of this great opportunity. Anyway, so that's the FFF. It's the bootstrap money. It's the money to get you going. And that gets you far enough along that then you can actually go talk to some angels. Angels, for those who don't know, are what's often referred to as rich individuals who like to dabble and sort of invest in startup companies. You know, oftentimes they're dumb money, meaning it's just like, oh, you seem like a good kid, that's a cool idea, here's, you know, 20 grand, go knock yourself out, you know, call me in 5 years when you're ready to pay me back. That's rarely the case. Usually it's more kind of smart money, in the sense that most angels are successful entrepreneurs that got a huge payout, like they got bought by, you know, Google for $200 million, and now they've got $100 million in their pocket, and they can only buy so many Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and so they, you know, to keep busy, they go back to their industry that they're from, and they like to help out up-and-coming entrepreneurs, and they kind of dabble and invest and do this sort of angel investing. It tends to mean that angel investors sort of go play back in the industries that they were most successful in. And the game industry to date, although, you know, we hear about the billions and billions that we make as an industry, you know, generally has not followed that model of kind of entrepreneurship, getting bought out, and now, you know, I'm a former game designer with millions and millions of dollars to burn. I'm going to go back and fund all these indies and stuff. I mean, I think we'll get there as an industry eventually, but we're not quite there yet. So there aren't that many angels that are active in the game space that are comfortable with the risk factors and understand the economics of games. So angels are actually quite hard to find in the game space. Not impossible, and sometimes you can certainly go find people that are comfortable with the mobile space or the web space or just sort of technology or entertainment in general, but still relatively hard in the game side of things. After that, you'd have seed stage VCs. So these now are professional investors. They belong to a venture fund. That fund has a mandate to invest in startups. If they're a seed level VC, well then their job as a fund is to invest in young companies, pre-profit companies or pre-revenue companies, and relatively small amounts. But these guys are professional investors. It's not just sort of a rich guy having fun, playing with money just to keep him or herself busy. Now, assuming you make it past the threshold and you start generating some actual profits and revenue, then you can go talk to sort of legitimate VCs or normal VCs that will invest largely based on sort of how much traction and success you've generated. To a certain extent, it's counterintuitive because you have to kind of go through all these other stages first before you can get to the normal VCs. And then even at this stage here, it's kind of the growth VCs, which, ironic enough, these guys are writing checks for like 20 or 30 or even $50 million, but you're already generating as a company, $10, $20 million. So they're there to sort of boost your growth. From a risk factor point of view, this is the riskiest, right? From a dollar amount point of view, this is the most money. This is the smallest. So even though the dollar amounts in the earlier stage might be, $5 grand from your mom or 10 grand from your uncle, it's in fact the riskiest stage, right? The chances of your mom getting that $5,000 back is extremely low. Whereas over here, sorry mom, over here, when you're already generating, $30 million of revenue and you want to expand to global markets or whatever, and you go to a growth VC and say, hey, I've been generating $20 million of revenue a year, give me another 30 so I can, double up. I mean, the dollar amount, the check might be huge, but the risk is actually quite small because you're already a proven company with track record. And it's no guarantee, of course, that you're actually going to double the investor's money, but it's much less risky, or much less risky than what's happening over here. In terms of amounts, I mean, generally speaking, this is kind of in the 10K range. This is sort of 20 to 50K. This is sort of 50 to sometimes, 250 plus. Really, sort of depends what you're up to. VCs maybe it's this could even go as high as 750. It really depends on what kind of company you're at. Here, generally, it's sort of 1 to 5 million, and here it's more sort of like the 10 to sort of 50. 10 to 50 million range. Again, these are super ballpark numbers. Angels might even be more like up to 100. Depends. So who you go talk to really depends on what stage your company is at, right? So if you're just here getting started, 3 guys, they quit their job at Ubisoft and it's like, let's go, make some indie games. You don't go talk to your VC friends. Because they're going to say, well, whoa, geez, that sounds great, but wait till you kind of go through all the rest here and get to the point where you're generating actual revenues, and then you can come talk to us. So when you're just getting started out, well, then you go talk to your friends, family, and fool. And generally, it's done in this kind of incremental way. That you take the investment that comes in one stage and use that to get you to a point that allows you to convince the next stage to give you more money. Right, so you use the 10 grand or the 5 grand from your mom and the 10 grand from your uncle plus the the $5,000 bonus check you got from Ubisoft. You put that all in, and then you make some super early rough prototype, and then with that prototype, now you go talk to the angels and say, look what we did with 15 grand and three people in 2 months. Hey, angel person, you should give us 50 grand so we can make extra. Get this far, submit it to the IGF, go to do these things, and then the angels, well, that sounds reasonable, that sounds sexy. Here you go, here's 20 or whatever $1,000 you need. You do that, and then you get to the point where now you go see the seed VCs and say, well, hey, we released an MVP on the App Store. It's actually generating revenue. It's not much, but we can see the traction's pointing in the right direction. We need 500 grand to finish the game and do global release, et cetera, et cetera. And then they give you the money. Generally speaking, all the stuff prior to revenues, you're selling the vision, right? You're selling the promise that, what you're going to deliver. Post this, you're selling actual traction. So this is, you're selling vision, and this is you're selling actual traction. And then who you go talk to at what stage really sort of depends on where you're at. And I think it's one of the biggest problems that I've seen with studios is like, well, there's just people out there in the world with money, and when I need it, I'll go get it. I'll go ask for it. Without, really thinking about who's providing what at which stage and where they're at as a company, etc. And I mean, it kind of makes me think of, when everyone was chasing publishers. I mean, some people are still chasing publishers, but there was always this sort of idea that like you had to know the publishers, like who's publishing what kind of games on which platforms. Like you have to do your homework to know who do I go talk to, who's going to be interested in what I'm doing. And it's the same thing for investors. They're interested in companies at different stages, at different sizes, and you need to be sort of cognizant of that. So that's sort of a quick overview-ish of the venture side of things. Something like Execution Labs, interestingly enough, I ran out of colors. Great. I mean, we're kind of the love money, because we love indies. But I mean, we go in at the earliest stages where it literally is, 3 people from Ubisoft that say, well, we want to work on our own stuff now. And here we are, and we're awesome, and we've got an idea, and we need some funding and resources to get going. And so we actually gamble at the earliest, riskiest stages, and generally, because of Execution Labs, teams can sort of skip over the angel part, do their MVP release down here, and then have access to seed VCs. And in fact, and just as a side note, teams that successfully graduate from Execution Labs are eligible for an extra $150,000. It's called a convertible note from BDC Venture Capital. A convertible note is just a style of funding, or it's rather a loan that you repay with shares in your company as opposed to money. But it's just another form of VC investment tool. But anyway, so just to put it in perspective from Execution Labs' point of view, we come in at the earliest stages and hopefully get you to the point where you can either not need investment at all because your game is taking off, or you're kind of ready for seed VCs. All right. Any questions on that before I move on? I know it's a lot. Yes, Ryan?
Where's government?
Well, so government generally does not fund companies.
Oh, right.
Right, so this was the venture side where this is the company stuff. The government is on the project side. Yes, Ryan?
Okay. Where would you put like Jobs Act or the new Canadian law change with company ownership through crowdfunding?
Company ownership through?
Crowdfunding. You can sell shares now.
Yeah. So there's some law changes that's going to allow equity-based crowdfunding. I would put that kind of in between FFF and angels because it's. I think you still need to be a qualified investor to do equity-based crowdfunding. So it's not like $50 from your gamer buddy. It's generally still. I don't know the exact rules, so don't quote me on it. But I think it's. In order to qualify to do equity financing, you have to be someone that has a net worth of $1 million or something like that, with a gross annual revenue of I forget, maybe $200,000 a year. So, and I think the minimum investments is something like $1,000 a shot. It might be more. My brain is fuzzy on it. But equity-based crowdfunding is not going to work the same way as sort of just the game, the normal Kickstarter. Where it's like, just give me $1. Any dollar is good. It's not gonna work that way. But yeah, I would sort of put that kind of in between the. All right, Justin.
I guess you're gonna probably cover this. Where do you find the 3 level? Like obviously 3F, out of 5, but angel, seed VCs, and VCs. Sometimes like if you're going to talk to somebody and then all of a sudden you realize you're in say a seed VC stage, you're talking to a VC, then you come around across something really. That's stupid, right?
Yeah, so for those in the back that didn't hear, I mean, the question is like, how do you find those people at the different stages? I mean, hopefully you know your family and you know where to find them. The fools maybe it might be a bit harder to find. Yeah, so this, I mean, this does come up, but I'll touch on it quickly here. Angels are probably the hardest to find, because these are generally, as I said before, it's just like rich people that make a crap ton of money from selling a company. They're just rich, and they're sort of dabbling and playing around. We don't have many game-specific angels because we just haven't had those kinds of successes, certainly in Canada. As seed VCs, you can find them on the web because these are professional, legitimate funds that have to have websites, and they list out who the partners are. I mean, they have websites for they're professional investors, whereas angels tend not to have, hey, I'm a rich guy, ask me for money type websites. But a big part of it is networking. I mean, I know we say networking is a good thing, but getting out there is super, super critical. Going to events like, I mean, luckily enough, there's one in Toronto called Game on Finance that happens. I don't know when the next one's scheduled for. There's a world out there of sort of the whole investor, startup, tech ecosystem that's really kind of this bizarro world in parallel to the game world, that a lot of people in the game world don't go check out that side of the other side of the world. And so a lot of those angel types and seed VCs, etc., they're just like hanging out at those other events, hackathons and boot camps and startup weekends and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not as familiar with the different types of groups and events that are going on in Toronto, but I can guarantee you there's probably something like a startup boot camp and hackathon, all that kind of stuff, like every week at least. And I think there's one resource called Startup Canada. I mean, just do like Toronto startups, and you'll probably see a ton of stuff. But you got to get out there and network and make friends and connect with folks and find out who they are. All right, right here.
We're starting to see some of the angels coming out now in San Francisco with some of the Google and the Facebook people are now starting to turn around and helping out development. It's more program-based and app-based stuff, but it's still starting to turn around. We're starting to see that now.
Yeah.
The other question I have is, where would you have launched your product in showing that chart? Would it be between the second and third? Yeah, right there. Yeah, as I figured.
Generally. I mean, it really depends where the launch is, but usually it's kind of in this phase, sort of at that dip. That's
so if you're not public at that point, don't go and see a CVC at that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, generally, if the product is not out, you're only talking to the 3Fs or angels or bootstrap, other project sources of financing and stuff. Generally, even a seed-based VC, will want to see some very preliminary traction. So, for example, one of the studios in Execution Labs is just finishing their 9-month cycle. Execution Labs, the first team started late January, early February. It's a 9-month program, roughly, give or take. And they take 6 months on average to produce an MVP, so the minimum viable product for release on the App Store. So that's kind of 6 months from there to here. And then they get 3 more months of what we call market acceleration, where we're doing user acquisition, we're doing analytics, they're making updates based on metrics, all this kind of stuff. And then at the end of that 3-month phase, then we go in front of BDC venture capital to gain access to their seed source of funding. And they want to see that, one, you know what numbers you're looking at. Even if you only have 1,000 users in the game, they want to know that you know exactly what those 1,000 users are doing. Are they converting at what rate? Where they're all the standard sort of metrics type stuff. Because they want to know that you're in a position to be able to track that and make intelligent business decisions on that going forward. But yeah, we're starting to see more stuff from the Valley, but generally the geographic distance is sort of a deterrent. All right, Ian.
Just wondering if you have a sense of what kind of volume of activity is happening in each of the categories, and if the Canadian and U.S. ecosystems are any different.
Yeah, so what volume is in each category? That's a really good question, and it always feels like it's never enough in any category. But Yeah, I mean, if you're in the right industries, there's actually a lot of angel money, but I mean, that's sort of tech more in general. And growth, there's always people that are willing to give you money when you're generating a lot of it. It's like, oh, you're making 50, well, here's 50 more. So there tends to be a lot of capital over there. I find the bigger gap is kind of bridging this, and actually we'll talk about a bit the funding gap. There was a recent report, global, not for Canada, on private investment placements and M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions activity, from a website called digi-capital, digi-capital.com. And I think they said there was like about $3.3 billion of M&A and I think close to $2 billion of private equity investments. But that's on a global scale, and a lot of that's being driven by strategic investors from Asia, like Gree and DNA and Nexon and Tencent and stuff like that. So in Canada, there's not a huge volume of money. I mean, you have Execution Labs that's here providing some capital, but I mean, we're doing 5 or 6 teams a year. You have, I mean, a few other incubators, accelerators that are providing early stage capital as well here. You have some early stage VCs like Real Ventures and Inovia, VanEdge, although VanEdge is less of a seed VC. But they tend to avoid games. So Real Ventures is one of our investors. They're classified as a seed VC, right? They do early stage investments. They invested in us because they didn't want to deal with the scariness of the sort of the game economics. So they saw our model as a way to invest in games and have us as game industry experts sort of find the right talent, give them the right resources, vet them, groom them, coach them, etc., so that we get them ready for here when then they would look for them. So part of the reason why our investors invested in us is because they want us to sort of get the teams ready to show them at that third stage, because they said game companies come to us and they're not ready for us. They don't know how to talk to us, their products aren't at the right stage, they have no clue how to structure them, all this kind of stuff. So we'll give you the money so you can give it to them here and help them get there so that they're ready to come see us. That's a bit of sort of why
is it different in the U.S. in terms of maturity level on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in general, the U.S. has just much more sort of activity and volume, and certainly a lot of that's coming out of Silicon Valley, although Boston, New York, a few other places have a decent volume. I mean, certainly in the Valley, you see a lot of noise in sort of this range, and then the more sort of traditional, Kleiner Perkins and the big ones kind of operating sort of on this hump. But yeah, generally there's just way more volume.
In indie games?
And not that much in games. Yeah, I mean, it's quite dry, especially with Zynga screwing up. But Supercell, yeah, Supercell just got sold 51% for
$2 billion.
Yeah, for like almost $2 billion, something like that. So that's I think going to get people excited again. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, VCs tend to invest in the areas that they know best, because they think they can understand the space. And so, how many people have heard a VC or an investor say, oh, games are hit-driven, right? That just means they don't understand the economics, right? They don't know how to parse the risks. Because it's like, fuck you, every business is a hit-driven business, right? It's like everything is hit-driven. So they'll often say, well, we'll invest in picks and axes, the plumbing. It's like, dude, even the plumbing is hit-driven. Like, just because they're comfortable with plumbing, they understand the business models. So when someone says, it's hit-driven, it just means it's just their way of saying they don't understand how to parse the risk factors. So what ends up happening is an investor will say, oh, well, this game stuff is so hot right now, let me try an investment, and we'll see how it goes. And they'll make one investment. Meanwhile, they've done like 30 e-commerce investments and another 30 mobile platform, whatever. So they're like doing all kinds of stuff, and they'll do one game thing. And they'll sit and they'll wait to see how that one game thing does. And while games are a hit-driven business, and so chances are that game thing's not going to do well. Just the odds are against it. So, oh, well, I tried one game thing and it didn't go well, so I'm not going to bother. It's too hit-driven. Meanwhile, they're piling in 30 of this and 30 of that. And so it's weird because they never will say, well, I can't make another e-commerce investment until my other 30 ones pan out, which is why I understand the space, it looks good, I'll invest. And so we're a little bit of that, I mean, even in the US, in that sort of bit of that immaturity phase where not enough people that came from or had intersected with the game industry are in those positions to make those kinds of decisions. So we just need all the old VCs to retire and some new game VCs to come through.
Do you have a rough idea of what you might be required to give up in each of those stages?
Oh yeah, good question. So what are you giving up in terms of equity stake? Oh yeah, I mean, so it really depends. Generally speaking, investors still want you to own the majority because they want you to be motivated. And this is sort of one of the myths or misconceptions, like, oh, if an investor comes in, they're going to grab 99% of the company, and I'm left with 1%. Well, if you have 1% of your company, like, it's like, well, screw that. You know, you just throw it in the garbage and move on. And so there's always this kind of balance of the investor wanting to be compensated for the money it's giving you and the risk it's taking, but still wanting you to be motivated and feel like you have ownership and a chance to succeed. So, yeah, I mean, just as a reference point, at Execution Labs, we take ballpark 15% for roughly $100,000 plus dollars. But I mean, you don't have anything. I mean, your company like doesn't even really exist at that point. Yeah, I mean, angels tend to take single-digit percentages. I mean, it depends on how much the check is. So the tricky part is the value of your company changes as you move along the green line, right? So the value of your company at the very start is essentially nothing, right? It's you and your idea and your buddy, and your mom, you know, says, okay, here's $5,000, and you're like, okay, mom, I'll give you 1% or 5%. I mean, like, it's kind of arbitrary. It really doesn't matter. It's like whatever they feel comfortable with. But then generally speaking, once you start getting into this phase, then people are trying to value your company. You know, how cool is the demo? What kind of technology you build? What's the pedigree of the programmers on your team? You know, what have you done? What projects have you been involved with, et cetera? And they're trying to gauge, you know, what your value is. But I don't have a super good answer there because it's so many factors involved. But it's, you know, generally speaking, it's something you want to fight for because what ends up happening is you get crunched, right? Here, your company's worth nothing, but you own 100% of it. Right, you sell 5% of it to your mom for $10,000. You take 50 grand from an angel and you give another 10%. So now you've given up. You know, where are we at? 15%. Then a VC comes in and says, "Fine, I'll give you $750, but I want 25% of your company." So there's always this kind of crunching, this kind of dilution that happens, and you want to make sure that by the time you get over here, you're still probably owning at least half of your company. I mean, once you're in this zone here now. You have potentially a valuation of $100 million. It doesn't matter as much if you own just 10 or 15%.
But I assume it goes down.
Yeah.
As the risk goes down. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. There was one at the back of the room, I think. Yeah.
How receptive are seed-based VCs to your gaming company and stuff in the mobile space? So, for example, Steam or consoles.
Steam, you say?
Well, Steam or the PC space or consoles.
Do you see them as a source of seed stage funding?
How receptive would VCs, how responsible
Oh.
the ones on the seed stage
Yeah.
to a company that's not in the mobile space?
Right.
I do see mobile space to be a little bit more attractive. So if you're making games for PC or making a console, is that attractive? Is that a place you see deals? You see companies?
So, yeah, that's a good question because I neglected or I forgot to mention that generally speaking, the investors today invest in the free-to-play business model. Whether that's on PC or whether that's on mobile, it doesn't have to be mobile. But the idea is that they're investing in games as a service that's scalable and it's kind of a funnel where the users come in free and you're retaining them, converting them, etc. So VCs are comfortable with that as a business model and understand it and can sort of draw parallels to e-commerce and web space and so on. Generally speaking, this does not apply to sort of a AAA style of I'm making a game for console, whether that's XBLA style digital console or digital release, or it's going to go on the shelf at Walmart. That, I suppose that's more hit driven than the rest of the hit drivenness of the game industry. Part of it is ongoing sustainability, in that every game you do in a free-to-play context, even if one of them is not super successful, serves to help the other games that you produce in kind of a portfolio, because then you're accumulating users, you're cross-promoting, you're building infrastructure and technology that then allows you to sort of better service all of the games in your portfolio. But that's not necessarily true when you make a horror game and release it and like, here it is world, and if it does great, then great, and then okay, well now I'm going to do an army action game, and here it is, and you can't like sort of cross-promote and leverage the user base in that sense. And then generally speaking, oftentimes then the project-based financing options tend to go more towards games that still feel like traditional sort of product console games that are not free-to-play, service-oriented, and so on. All right, I'll take one more question before. Yeah, go ahead.
So you skip over publishers. What's the difference? Why would I go with publisher versus VCs?
So publisher is not investing in your company, right? They're investing in a product. You say, well, here's my Ninja in Space game. You want it? Well, yeah, I need $1 million to finish it, and then you get distribution and sales rights, and we'll split revenue, 70-30 or whatever. So they're investing in your project. They're not saying, here's $1 million, I'm investing in your company vision. Now, what I'm not touching here is mergers and acquisition, where Activision says, well, I'm going to buy you, and I'm just going to absorb your company. That's different than an investment. So again, you need to think about the difference between, am I funding a single project and chasing publishers or government grants or trying to win IGF prize money for that project? Or am I really trying to build a company where I have a vision for this type of game or culture that I'm trying to create, and I'm really selling that vision? All right, awesome, all good questions. So there's one gap we kind of touched on. I guess it was Ian that sort of brought up this. They call it the gas tank is not full, or it's essentially the seed funding gap, where VCs will often tell you, well, I don't want to give you money if I feel that it's not going to fill up your gas tank. Like if I feel that you're not going to cross the finish line, then why am I going to fill up your gas tank halfway? Right? We need to fill up the gas tank. That's why I have this sort of silly gas tank filling up image. But so the hardest part, the hardest gap is the gap between the seed to VC. That normally you can get investment up to a certain point, and then you have to prove that you can generate revenue and acquire users and do all that kind of stuff. And because games are hard to produce and it's hard to find, it takes extra time and all that kind of stuff, you generally tend to kind of run out of money or run out of runway before you're able to prove that. And then you're like, well, crap, I need more money. And then you go see the next stage of VC, and they say, well, you're not ready for us. You didn't get to the next proof point. I sort of hinted at it, but this is, ironically enough, for those who have read The Lean Startup, or potentially sick of The Lean Startup at this point, I think it still really applies. But investors actually think in the same way, right? The Lean Startup, you kind of go through this build, measure, learn loop of validated learning. And you would not believe how many times investors talk about validated learning and sort of proof points and answering assumptions and stuff. And I think most of them haven't even necessarily read the book. But as I mentioned before, you're generally taking the money from one stage to prove to the next stage of investors that you're investable. Or essentially go through the sort of build, measure, learn loop to do validated learning. So listen, I was nothing. It was me, myself, and my friends who had an idea to build this Ninja in Space game and build a company around it. And so, here's the prototype we said we would build, and now it's built. So we kind of proved that we can do that, and now we need money to prove the next thing. And this is kind of, incremental investment. It's a pain in the butt, but no one's going to give you sort of, $10 million. Say, listen, don't worry about it. I've got this 5-year vision. It's going to be awesome. Just give me $10 million and I'll come back to you in 5 years. Like it just doesn't happen. And so it's a very kind of incremental process where you're taking a chunk of money to prove the next point, then you go get the next chunk of money and prove the next point. It is tough. But for those who haven't read The Lean Startup, I highly recommend it. I think it's valid both for how you actually manage your production, but also how you think of the business side of things. And VCs really adopt the Lean Startup mentality, even if they don't necessarily know that that's what they're doing. All right, in terms of some tips, we touched on it before in Justin's question, this idea of networking and being connected. So I think that the more you can get out there, the more you can talk to people, the easier it's going to get. And that's coming out to events like this. It's going to these sort of hackathons or startup weekends. It's as painful as it may be, like going to panels that are hosted by accounting firms and law firms and stuff that often host these kinds of things with VCs and investors and governments and all that kind of stuff. It sounds like a pain in the butt and a waste of time, but like you have to be out there if you want to be able to gain access to these sources of funding. Interestingly enough, or sort of not surprisingly enough, but most investment decisions are not rational decisions, right? It's someone heard something, that you were up to something cool, and I had to come talk to you, and I heard two people say that, so there must be some, or we went to one of those parties and we got drunk and had a great time. Like it just feels like, and I shouldn't say this, but in part that's how Execution Labs was funded. In Taiwan, no less. Okay, well, get me drunk at the bar after and I'll finish the story. But I'm serious. It was, we just had a great time. They're like, what's that thing you're doing? How much? Yeah, we're in. So it's as silly as that. But being connected, getting out there, meeting people is super important. And that's true not just in terms of chasing potential investors and angels and stuff, but it's also true just in terms of all of us, each other. That sharing what you're working on, getting feedback, even if it's super, super early, is critical. And the CAPI guys, Nathan and Chris, they talk about this all the time, right? Kind of having beers with friends, and that's a big part of why they succeed. They just sort of talk and share and give feedback, take feedback, all this kind of stuff. And a big resistance to that I often hear is like, well, geez, I don't want my idea to get stolen. And like nobody cares. Right? Everyone has their own idea to steal, to be worried about stealing your idea. And it's like, well, but Zynga, they clone, they steal. Listen, Zynga will clone your game after you've made $1 million or $10 million and have $100 million. Then they'll, at that point you'll have lots of money to pay lawyers and all that kind of stuff. So Zynga and the big boys, they only clone and copy you once you've already been successful. So, coming to an IGDA event and sharing your ideas to get feedback to help you learn, to improve, is not, the risk is so infinitesimally small that it's way more valuable to be open and sharing it. And certainly at Execution Labs, we encourage all the teams to be very open. They share with each other. They, every week, every other week, we do team presentations. Everyone gives questions, or gives feedback and asks questions. They all come out to the local IGDA events and stuff like that. So super critical to just kind of get out there. And actually, often enough, it's sort of these sort of serendipitous moments that you come to an IGDA event and you show your demo to someone and say, oh, that's cool, you should talk to my friend at this company that, and that friend just so happens to know the guy who works at and that just stuff just kind of happens naturally, if you're out there and if you're, you're open to those kind of opportunities. Another one is this idea of pitching, sort of making presentations. And most game developers suck massively at presenting their games. Like really, the industry as a whole is pretty crap at this because we're so stuck in the details, right? We're so stuck in the, this ninja game and it's like 5 different katanas with different steel, like nobody cares. And so what's the core essence of the game? What is it really that the experience that I'm selling? How do I present that? And certainly when you're presenting to investors, they almost don't even care about the idea itself. right? It's like ninjas, robots, pirate, like whatever, like it's all the same thing to me. You know, who's the team that's making it? You know, what's the big vision? How are you going to make it different than other companies? You know, why do I give you the $1 million instead of the other person the $1 million who also says they want to make ninja game? Like it's not about the ninjas. It's about all this other stuff that, generally speaking, as game developers, we're not always comfortable talking about those things. We really want to get into the different steels that the katanas are made with, and how it's simulated with a pixel shader, and you know, whatever. It's kind of irrelevant from a presentation or pitch point of view. Now, the interesting thing is, the better you get at sort of consolidating your concept and really able to share the essence of what is awesome about you as a team or as a company, and your vision and what the project is, that's not just for investors, but that's for everyone. Right, so the next time you're at one of the IGDA events, or you're down at GDC, and you're able to sort of in a snap say, oh yeah, my team is this, and we're working on this awesome project, and you know, here's our vision, and you're able to do that in like 90 seconds, often what's called the elevator pitch. Like, that's useful to you whenever when you're in front of anybody, whether it's just another dev, a press, or someone you're trying to hire, et cetera, being able to communicate, you know, what your project is and what your company vision is super, super valuable. And so, while many devs feel uncomfortable with the idea of pitching, because that feels like I'm a car salesman or whatever, actually being able to articulate your vision is a super critical skill, you know, across the board, not just, you know, to go chase money. When you are in front of investors, I mean, there's actually a lot of resources on the internet and books and stuff in terms of how to, like, you know, present or to do a pitch and all that kind of stuff. So I won't go into too much detail, but generally speaking, investors do want to see some kind of insight, right? So what is it that, you know, your understanding of the marketplace that allows you to you know, whatever, access a different audience, or meet a different need or desire that nobody else is really addressing? You know, what's unique about your experience that's different than anyone else's? You want to provide some kind of insight into the market, into the player base, into the products, so that the investor says, oh shit, I never thought of that. And I don't mean like ninjas underwater or ninjas in space. I mean, you know, like for example, one of the teams was talking about board games, right? So the size of the board game business, you know, is whatever, $1 billion plus. It's growing at X% a year. It's not being driven by the traditional games like Monopoly, but it's more the European sort of, you know, really innovative style of board games that, you know, are easily translated to digital formats. And so, you know, as a company, we want to sort of disrupt the board game industry, and we're going to build board games that bring families together on an iPad. You know, so it's, I mean, there's a vision there. It's not just, I had this idea of putting ninjas on a board and I'm going to play this ninja board game. It's like I'm going after the, you know, the board game business, and I'm going to steal $1 billion from, you know, who makes Monopoly? Mattel? No, Hasbro, whatever. You know, so what's that insight? You know, what's the sort of intersection of different trends and stuff? And then, of course, what opportunity does that represent? You know, so you don't want to have this amazing insight and then say, well, there's 10 of those people in the world, and we're going to capture that market, you know, because that's not enough of a market, so it has to represent a decent size opportunity. I mean, obviously spending time on the team and what, you know, each team member's, what his or her pedigree is, what they've done. I mean, essentially the investors are making a bet on the team. Execution Labs, I mean, almost everything we do in terms of the teams we select, it's about the team. It's about the camaraderie, the cohesion, their track record and history together. Have they gone to hell and back? It's so much about team and team risk that almost everything we do as part of the application vetting process is about the team. And most investors are the same way. They really are investing in the people. And I don't want to say all the other stuff is secondary, but it's really foremost about the team. So don't discount the value of the team and being able to present, you know, who the team is and what you've done. And then the other bit that's, you know, people often don't think about is this idea of traction. Investors will talk about traction all the time, and there's really two kinds of traction. One is what I call internal traction, meaning how far have you gone? You know, how many, you know, what's the prototype you've built? How, you know, has the MVP released? You know, what have you actually done with your time and resources? So actual real progress. But then there's all the external traction or external validation, which is were you nominated for the IGF? Did you get selected to present at some hackathon? Do you have 10,000 Facebook followers? Did people sign up for to get a newsletter for pre-access to the game? Or all these kinds of things which show validation, right? Because most investors, they're swayed, as I said before, it's not logical, it's irrational. And if you can say, well, geez, we're at GDC, we got this many press hits, and we have this many Twitter followers, like all this stuff showing interest in what you're doing, that sort of makes them more confident, like, well, damn, these people are up to something good if they're winning awards and getting all these followers and stuff. And so this idea of traction is actually quite important, which feeds into a whole other thing which is important for indies, which is a whole other talk, is the marketing and PR. I mean, certainly if you're an independent studio, you really have to spend time on the marketing and PR side, like from the very beginning. Not like hide out in the basement, make the game, and then say, oh, hey world, we have a game. You really have to do all of that stuff, going up to launch, and really has to be kind of a key part of, or a key role of someone on the team, even if they don't have a marketing background. But there's a whole other discussion, but really super, super critical. So that way, 6 months in, when the game is pre-release, but you've been doing marketing and PR along the way, and you've been in an indie showcase at Casual Connect, and you have 10,000 followers, and you've had these sort of pre-release interviews. It's somewhat intangible, but it means something to investors. It shows that you're out there and being noticed, etc. So it's actually quite critical. The last little bit of advice is the legal side. So yeah, whenever I think of lawyers, for some reason I think of Half-Life. Are there any lawyers in the room? Manuel is not here tonight, so. No, I like lawyers. Lawyers are super cool, but it's actually quite critical to involve lawyers in the process. If you're gonna take someone else's money, you're gonna end up signing contracts, and you just don't want to get fucked. And it happens all the time. So we joked about Phil Fish in the beginning, right? That whole movie, or his part of it anyways, is based on a busted contract of ownership and rights over the IP of the game. Because I don't think they involved a lawyer, or at least if they did, it was like his uncle who's a divorce lawyer or something, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, if Phil had hired a lawyer to review those contracts and had a shareholder agreement, all this kind of stuff, like we wouldn't have Indie Game the movie, or Phil wouldn't be in it to find someone else that was having drama. So super, super critical to involve the lawyers. I mean, the IGDA Toronto is lucky that Manuel from, what is it, it's Media Slot. Super, super cool guy, loves games, and is also just a really wicked lawyer that understands the entertainment business and has experience. And often you take him for a nice lunch and buy him a gin tonic, and you'll get at least an hour of free advice. Like 2 gin tonics if you want a little bit more. But anyways, I mean, so there are people that have knowledge, and I'm sure there's others in town that have some experience with games and entertainment. I'm not suggesting you need to sort of spend half of your budget paying for the fancy lawyers, but you need to get someone that has some sense of it. I mean, it's just critical because you don't want to get screwed. So don't be afraid to engage the scary lawyers. And even within the co-founder, there's kind of when let's say 3 co-founders are starting a new studio and like it's all kind of awesome and the sky's the limit and so on. It's kind of like when you're getting married. It's like, oh well, here's the prenup. Well, you don't want to even consider that the future is not going to be always awesome. But signing stuff like shareholder agreement and stuff is actually quite critical. And then just in terms of a couple of books, again, there are a lot of books out there. There are a lot of web resources and tons of videos, all kinds of stuff. But if you're a book reader type person, the 2 that I recommend is Venture Deals. So Venture Deals actually goes through how venture deals are done, and then goes through the types of contracts you would sign and sort of breaks them down so that when you do go talk to your lawyer, you actually know what all this stuff is about. Talks about stuff like valuation, the different sources of funding, as well as the sort of legal aspects of control over the board, as well as the economics and how all that stuff is done. So quite sort of technical in the sense of like the legal aspects. And then a more broad book is the Art of the Start from Guy Kawasaki, which really is about sort of startup culture, where here's how you go about starting something and how you approach the team building process, how you approach fundraising, and a good chunk of the book is spent on how you pitch yourself and how you present your vision and stuff like that. Again, there's a ton of other books and resources out there, but that's one, or rather those are two in particular that I find as a good starting point. There's blogs and all kinds of stuff you can find. So those are my sort of tips and overview of funding. Once again, I think the most critical part at the very beginning is deciding whether or not you're getting funding for your project or your company, because that's kind of really the initial forking that happens. And then once you make that decision or understand that you're going for one versus the other, then what you do and the options that exist are quite different. Get out there, connect with folks, really focus on how you're presenting yourself and pitching, and sort of really the core essence, and not about the 5 different steels of the blades and whatnot, and become friends with lawyers, or at least one lawyer. All right, thank you very much, folks. And that wasn't a question, right?
We can go till 9.
All right, and can someone grab the mic, because there were a few questions that were not heard. You want to run around with the mic, Ryan?
Yeah, sure.
An exercise?
Because I love running.
This thing doesn't work.
Oh.
Is it not on?
No, it's not.
That's okay, they gave us another battery. Ask your question while I recharge it.
I'll talk loudly. You broke it down between funding for a project and funding for a studio. Why can't I do both?
You can. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. I mean that's a valid question. It meets all the rules. Yeah, so you can certainly go get both. You may end up in conflicts where, for example, let's say you take CMF money and you have to recoup $1 million and have all these constraints, and then a Valley investor wants to come up and say, I really like what you're doing, I want to invest. And then all of a sudden taking their money means that you're sort of disqualified because now X% of ownership is not going to be Canadian, and or the investor freaks out when they realize you owe back all that money as a recoupable loan, or for example, Execution Labs, our model is we take a small equity stake, but we also take 30% on revenue for 1 year. So if you already took CMF money where you're paying back, I think it's 50% or whatever the rate is, and then you also, if you took money from us, it was 30%, then like you're left with nothing, and so that's not fair to you. And so depending on the nature of the investors, you may have sort of overlapping terms where you owe stuff on the project or have constraints on the IP, and then that sort of deters or is in conflict with the way that the company-based investors want to work. And so, for example, the reason why we cut off our rev share at a year is because we don't want to encumber you, A, to grow, but also for investors who follow us and, well, geez, I'm not going to give you money if 30% of that is going out the door to these Execution Lab guys. So we cut it off, and then we own a small piece of you anyway, so we want to see you grow and evolve. So inherently, there's no reason why you can't go sort of chase different monies. Just be cognizant that when you're sitting in front of a VC type investor, you're talking about the company and the vision and the roadmap of projects you have going. Whereas when you're talking to the CMF, it's project funding, it's the one ninja game with the 5 blades, and and that's the innovation, and it's that project you're getting money for. And then just make sure you kind of not overlapping commitments for recoups and stuff like that. All right, is the microphone working, or?
Yeah, sorry, Jason, the mic's not working.
All right, so everyone please speak loudly so everyone can go ahead.
Where do you think Kickstarter and crowdfunding fits in the like friends, family, fools, angels, so forth and so on?
Fools, I think. So Kickstarter doesn't really fit into the curve because again, the curve was for company-based funding options, whereas Kickstarter is a project-based funding option. I mean, if I had to kind of do an overlay of where they might go, I mean, they definitely fall into the sort of the friends, family, and fools. They're giving you small amounts of money. You know, most of them, well, most, I mean, some of them are your friends and family that give you that money and so on. But again, it's in the other chunk, which is the project-based financing. So, I mean, that's why you see some projects that are done by complete startups and, you know, or kids out of school. And then you have companies that have been around 15 years, like Double Fine, that are also using Kickstarter because it's kind of on a different axis. It's not based on the life cycle of the company. Yeah, go ahead.
You said the film model of funding didn't catch on. Was that because it was a bad model for games or for another reason?
Well, I'll caveat that and say that the film financing is not my expertise, but I think part of it was the unpredictable nature of game. Essentially, our own suckage at project management is sort of what disqualified us from that model. In that it's, I mean, there's 3 parties to a bond. It's generally a bank or an investor, it's a publisher, and it's a developer. And so the publisher promises to the investor that they'll publish the game if it's delivered on time and on budget. The bank gives the money to the developer who promises, yeah, I'll do it on time and on budget. And then there's a kind of a floating entity called the auditor that then sort of checks in on you every month to make sure you're hitting your milestones, all that kind of stuff. And guess what? Most projects weren't on time and weren't on budget, and so investors kind of got burnt and the deals went sour. It's very hard to manage. Where, I mean, films certainly have their own unpredictabilities, but are, as a project, much more predictable to manage in that sense. So are bondable and auditable, whereas games generally were not. But I mean, that's a fairly gross overgeneralization to that. Way at the back.
The 15K that you're typically giving to companies with execution labs or another accelerator like into a company, what do you see those companies typically spending that 15K on? Do they pay themselves a little bit? Do they buy assets or marketing spend or what?
Yeah, so most accelerator programs are of a short duration for a small amount of money. So something like Grow Lab or Founder Fuel are in the kind of 25 to 50K range in exchange for, let's say, 10%-ish. You know, it really depends on where those companies are spending money. In some cases, it's to hire an additional, web designer or contractor or something like that. Sometimes it's to, pay rent on a studio. I mean, it really depends. The Execution Labs model is quite different in that the developers come to us before they're incorporated. So we actually pay the funding as a wage. It's $2,000 per team member per month for 9 months. That's about, for a team size max of 5. So that's upwards of 90K over a 9-month span. Plus we commit an extra $10,000 minimum on test market user acquisition spend just to kind of get some users in the game for data analysis. And then there's access to larger amounts of funding on user acquisition. Plus, if you sort of don't shoot each other during the program and you graduate, then you have access to the additional $150,000 from BDC. So you're looking at $250,000, $300,000 coming through the Execution Labs program. But the bulk of that funding is spent on wages because we pay it to you as a wage, as well as marketing dollars. That being said, if you're in the Execution Labs program, you're not paying rent. We're giving you the development machines. All the software is on there, like Photoshop and Max and Unity, all that kind of stuff. Office is all on there. We send you to GDC. We send you to Casual Connect, that kind of stuff. So $2,000 is still, I mean, it's like survival money. So there is still the sense that you're putting in, either you're burning into your personal savings a little bit, or you're tightening your own belt, kind of putting sweat equity into the company that you're going to go. Yeah, Jean-Guy.
Just as a quick follow-up, so are the people that you work with at Execution Labs, those companies, are they actually then employees of Execution Labs?
Yeah. Yeah, so during the program, they are considered employees of Execution Labs. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One is because they tend to be quitting their jobs at other companies. So they were working at EA yesterday, and tomorrow they're working with us. And so we don't sort of bog them down with like, go figure out how to make a company and incorporate and do a shareholders agreement and worry about, like, just, you know, you're a programmer and an artist and designer, you know, quit your job, jump ship, come be an indie, you know, come into the lab, get focused on working on your prototype right away. And then part of the mentorship and the coaching is to train all of those things and give you those resources so that in 9 months' time we say, okay, Jean-Guy, now it's time. You gotta set up and sort of, you know, leave the lab, leave the mothership, and then, you know, become a company. You'll be in a much better position to do that. In fact, I missed a session today back at the lab from Ernst & Young that came and did a whole session on accounting. It sounds boring, but accounting and taxes and sort of how to set up your company in a way so you don't get screwed and all that kind of stuff. And next week we have Faskin coming in doing a session on incorporation, shareholder agreements. Faskin came in last month and did a session on IP rights. I mean, that's in addition to the more game-specific stuff where we have designers and producers and artists coming in to give feedback on your game specifically. But so the Execution Labs model is quite unique. There's nobody else that does it that way, and we did it specifically because we're game-focused, and we believe that was the model that would work best for game developers. Yeah, over here.
One more, Jason?
Only one more. All right.
Make it a good one. So the other side, basically, this is all success stories kind of thing, but if you get to the later stage funding and you fail, are there any kind of repercussions or fallout you could expect, like legal, financial, or otherwise?
So what's the fallout? So if Execution Labs falls apart and everything goes to hell, I just keep going, right? It's just like, oh, well, that was fun, and you know, we learned a lot. Generally, this is why it's called venture funding, is they're taking a risk on this crazy, idea. I mean, certainly if you put some of your own money into the company, well, you lose that. Generally speaking, you're not personally on the hook for that kind of funding, right? The CMF doesn't say, well, I'll give you, $1 million for your ninja game, but if you screw up, only out of your own. So it's like, well, we tried it, we gambled, and tough luck. But I mean, you do have to be careful to a certain extent that you do involve the scary lawyers to make sure there wasn't some little, by the way, your house is, ours if you. Usually that's not the case, and you're not on the hook personally for stuff to screw up, other than your reputation and whatever, all that kind of stuff. Cool. All right, do we really have no time for no more? Asshole. All right, folks, well, I'm going to hang